Well, I've got a confession to make. In the roughly 30 years that I've known Paul Williams, I don't think I've ever given him a Christmas gift or a birthday gift. I've bought him lunch, but that's about it. So, Paul, here's your gift. I know that you're a voracious reader, and this is an American book. It's called The Great Vanishing Act, Blood, Quantum, and the Future of Native Nations. But then I realized you probably know as much about this as the author does. I'm going to give it to you anyway when the pandemic is over, but that launches us into the discussion of blood quantum. What is it?
Alan, first of all, thank you. Didn't know about the book. It really is the toughest question we face, and it reaches into the guts of every Indigenous family and every Indigenous nation. And I like to go to Paul Gauguin's famous Tahitian painting, where in French along the side it says, "Who are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going?" And in Indian country you'd add, "And will there be food?" It's the toughest question because it says to you, not just who are we, but what does we mean? And Indigenous languages are very different from English in pronouns. We, under Canada's Indian Act, a community can have a vote, split up all its assets among its listed members. And every community I've ever dealt with says, no, it isn't just us who happen to be alive today. We're carrying what our ancestors gave us. We have obligations to the generations that aren't born yet. That's who we is. And in fact, we insisted on a paragraph like that in the negotiation framework agreement. And it was fascinating to see what the federal and provincial reaction was. You have federal government lawyers saying, how many generations? How long's a generation to future generations? And you say we've got a legacy from our ancestors. Can you define it? And we're sitting there stunned that they don't understand that some of these things aren't measurable and don't matter. And just because you can't measure it doesn't mean you don't mention it.
But what can be measured to a certain extent is whether you are half of one culture or ethnicity, half of the other, or religion, or a quarter, or a tenth, and what does that mean? And that gets us into the blood quantum issue, doesn't it?
Well, I'll give you an example that's fresh this week. In 1995, there was construction going on in in Youngstown, New York, and a bunch of archaeologists dug up the remains of 14 people who'd been buried together, men, women, and children. Very clearly, these people were part of the refugee camp of Haudenosaunee Iroquois people at Fort Niagara during the American Revolutionary War. 12 of them had typical North American Indian shovel-shaped incisors. 2 of them didn't. The Haudenosaunee attitude is these people were family. Doesn't matter what their race was. And can you be half one culture and half another culture? We get into that discussion in dealing with human remains because the archaeologists end up saying, well, at 1000 AD, people moved from being hunter-fisher gatherers to being agriculturalists. Therefore, if your grandfather was a hunter and you're a farmer, you aren't culturally affiliated with him. And I say, my grandfather was a butcher. I'm a lawyer. His first languages were Czech, German, and Italian. My first languages are English, French, and Spanish. Does that mean I'm not culturally affiliated with the men who taught me ethics and stars and jokes and opera? How do you measure?
I must say, Paul, a butcher and a lawyer, I think, have a great deal in common, very similar professions, but that's probably another interview.
Not nearly as much as pirates and lawyers.
But let me answer your question. Can you be half one thing and half another? Well, many of us do say I'm half German and I'm half Irish, or I'm half Spanish and I'm half this. So people say that in conversation, and then comes around the really difficult one, and that is St. Patrick's Day. All of a sudden, everybody's Irish, or Robbie Burns Night. All of a sudden, people are wearing kilts, and I've participated in those things, and I don't know whether there's any Scottish or Irish in me. No harm done until you apply for entitlements or reparations from the Battle of Culloden, or the sorts of things that Indigenous people in North America are entitled to. That's when who you are takes on a legal perspective, doesn't it?
And it begins with Canada's ancestor, making laws to remove trespassers from Indian reserves. In order to do that, Canada needed to make laws about who was entitled to be on the reserve. And from there, it moved into a policy of assimilation. And blood quantum, Canada doesn't explicitly put it into the Indian Act, but it's implicitly there. The Indian Act still is designed to remove people who are less than 1/4. It just doesn't say it right out front. And part of the problem is anytime you impose a dividing line on a family or a community from the outside, you're telling people, this is who you are, this is who your children are, this is who you're allowed to marry without harming your family. This is where you are allowed to live. This is my 2 daughters. They have the same parents. One was born after April 15th, 1985, 6 months later. She is a different category under the Indian Act than her older sister.
Well, I barely restrained myself from interrupting and asking a question, because when you said that Canada made a decision, or the antecedent of the Canadian country made a decision about who could go on Indian land and thus who was an Indian, my initial thought was, by what right does one nation, culture, state, geographic entity impose that decision or make that ruling for another? It's kind of like the UN or the US coming into Canada and saying, well, wait a minute, Mr. Williams, we've been looking in your file and you aren't really Canadian. You shouldn't have a pension or health care or what have you, and you probably shouldn't even be here, so get lost. I mean, it's really quite outrageous when you think of it.
Even more so when it's the latest comers who are telling the people who've been here for millennia who they are and who they aren't. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And Canada, in its policies today, sets self-determination first, but then imposes the limits of the Indian Act.
Now, Paul, on the back of your present is a very interesting cartoon, which you probably can't read very well, but it basically—
I've seen it.
You've seen it? It's the so-called disappearing Indian. And we had, or have, I guess, still in this country, you tell me, but the so-called double mother provision, where depending on who marries whom over your lineage, all of a sudden you've disappeared as a status or non-status Indian. Tell us about that.
Okay. I will, and then I'd like to move on into what we are doing right, rather than how do we avoid doing what was wrong. I knew Jimmy John Jock because I used to go out with his wife's sister. And this goes back 30 years. And the Indian Act until 1985 said if your mother and your father's mother were not Indians, other than by marriage, then you would stop being an Indian at the age of 21. And Jimmy Jock, his mother was Mohawk from the American side of Akwesasne, and his grandmother, his father's mother, was white. I'm sorry. His grandmother was white. As a result, he stopped being an Indian under the Indian Act on his 21st birthday. His wife, who was Mohawk, stopped being an Indian automatically because now she was married to a non-Indian. and their daughter stopped being an Indian. And this ended up in a county court in Cornwall, Ontario, and the judge is looking at a bunch of people who are obviously Mohawk. And if you were playing blood games, Jimmy Jock is 75% Mohawk, and Canada's removing him under a provision designed to catch people who are 25%. And his wife's 100%, and she's being removed. And the judge just said, no, I'm not going to play this game. And that was before the double mother clause was removed from the act. But our problem with blood quantum is, first of all, it's racist. We were in a meeting with the U.S. government about border crossing rights, and the lawyer for the immigration department said, how are you guys going to deal with blood quantum? Because the U.S. law says 50%. And we said, we're not. You've been fudging it for 80 years. Nobody can measure blood quantum accurately, and it's racist. And that lawyer said, well, it's our law. How are you going to do it? And I said, well, maybe you can help us. What percent American are you by blood? And he took the bait and said, I'm 100% American. Every citizen of the United States is 100% American. That's how our law works. And one of the Mohawk chiefs said, well, that's how our law works too. Why don't you show some respect? And really, that's the problem with blood quantum, is it doesn't address, it's racist and it's racial, and it doesn't address who is the person culturally, politically. It brings in concepts that both Canada and the United States have rejected, both for their own people and their own laws, and imposes them on Indigenous peoples.
Well, Paul, one punchline.
How do we get away from it?
One punchline I take from this is that it is really up to the nation or the culture or the political entity to decide who is a citizen. So that American was speaking American, and if he wasn't Indigenous, he was from somewhere else some number of years ago. But okay, he's American, and that seems fair game. The thing I wanted to ask you about, though, is you've used the term racist 4 or 5 times, and it is a word that is being thrown around a lot these days. I'm not sure I know the definition. No less an authority than my son says, if there is one human race, how can there be racism? Because there aren't several different races. Now, that's not necessarily an educated opinion, but he's an educated person. So what is racist about deciding that you're half German and half Indigenous, or half American going back 4 generations and the other half is Indigenous, or something? How is this racist?
Okay. If you're half German and half Indigenous, German is a political definition. You can be of Italian origin and become a German citizen. Or at the very least, German in the sense that you've used it is ethnic political. There are boundaries to what is German. Indigenous, or what used to be Indian, is a purely racial term that doesn't take into account, are you Haudenosaunee, are you Chippewayan, are you Mi'kmaq? So you're using 2 different concepts in describing one person. And the point is, Peskotomuhkati is not what race are you, it is what is your citizenship. You don't ask a Canadian, what race are you, to determine whether that person is Canadian. And understanding that citizenship in an Indigenous nation is a political concept, that the Crown has treaties with a political entity and not a racial one, is where we begin.
So that political entity should be able to bestow citizenship on who it feels like bestowing, or have the criteria that it wishes to use. And it's not the other political entities, i.e. Canada or the US, it's not their business to pass judgment on that.
And Canada's accepted that by accepting the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is explicit about self-determination. and by accepting the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. So that's what we're dealing with. The challenge is, okay, so we have self-determination. How do we use it? And it gets back to that fundamental question, who belongs? And what we've done carefully over the last 10 years in community meetings is peel that question away, sort of like taking a flower one petal at a time, because there are some fundamental decisions that have been made at a level of principle rather than detail. So the first decision was, we're one people. This river that flows through us and that has somebody else's boundary in it doesn't mean we are two people. We're one nation. That's step one. So it doesn't matter whether somebody is a Canadian citizen or a US citizen. It matters, is that person a Peskotomuhkati citizen? That's step one. Step two is, we don't define our citizenship by blood quantum. Partly because blood quantum is a virtual guarantee that you will disappear. So step three is, how do we decide who belongs if we're not going to use blood quantum? And the answer to that one ends up mainly being, and it's sort of visceral, it's a gut thing. The anthropologist David Maybury Lewis, who wrote a big book called Millennium, he was adopted by the Savante people in the Amazon. And he came out of it saying, for most Indigenous people, it's really simple. If I can call you cousin, you're one of us. And in Peskotomuhkati culture, family is core. Nobody sits down with his cousin and has in the forefront of his mind, I'm half, he's a quarter, somebody else is 37.5%.
Okay, that's
either my cousin or it's not.
That's sort of an overview of blood quantum. Then there is geographic location. It would be hard to say, oh, let's include those people who moved to Europe 100 years ago in the Peskotomuhkati Nation because they originally came from, somewhere in Maine or New Brunswick. I don't know how you'd handle that. But then the third thing is lifestyle and culture and way of life. The Métis, I believe, are successfully arguing that it's in part your hunting and trapping and fishing and song and language and way of life that dictates who you are. What do you say to those two things?
4 or 5 things in a row. One is, and I'm familiar with situations where somebody shows up in an Ojibwe community, he's 45 years old, and his father was an Ojibwe soldier in the Canadian Army fighting its way through Holland. And this man's a Dutchman. And he's also a Lavalley. And he shows up in the community and they say, cousin. And they hand him from family to family to family for 6 weeks. And there's no doubt that yeah, he was in Europe. Nobody's ever seen him before. He's one of us. That's extreme, but it's an answer to your question, really. Eastern Métis, there is a whole controversy over people, especially in Quebec, but also in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, finding an Indigenous ancestor, declaring themselves to be Métis, and claiming constitutional rights. And the people who assert real Métis rights in the Red River Valley, for example, are saying, wait a minute, we have a language, we have a distinct culture, we are real people, and these other folks are invented and they're latecomers and they just want a piece of the pie. And we, Nova Scotia and the Mi'kmaq and the Métis National Council have all rejected them. But what comes out of this partly is the Supreme Court of Canada in a case involving a guy named Roddy Powley in Sault Ste. Marie. They were dealing with the problem because they'd already decided that Aboriginal rights are gelled at the moment an Indigenous people meets their first European. Nobody's ever said, hey, wait a minute, what's so special about your first European that he gels your rights? But the first time you meet an African or an Asian or an Aztec, nothing happens. That's still a problem in Canadian law. But then the Supreme Court had to deal with what about Métis rights? And they had to realize the first Métis could not have appeared until at least 9 months after the encounter with the first European who showed up.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. Yeah.
So how do they decide what are Métis rights? And the answer became Métis have a totally different timeline than Indians. Métis rights are measured not by date of first contact, but by the date the Crown establishes effective control of the area. This is a multiple problem, because if we're talking about 1609 in Peskotomuhkati country, that we have to prove what was important to the Peskotomuhkati people at that time, that's hard. Got no written record. It's 400 years ago. If there were local Métis, the Crown didn't establish control of the area until the 1780s, 2 centuries later. Now, to get back to Peskotomuhkati issues, the problem is if you're talking about establishing culture, language, community continuity in one place, we're dealing with people whose language was deliberately suppressed by the Crown, whose land base was shattered, whose culture was discouraged. People were prosecuted for hunting and fishing, which was not just a treaty right, it was their way of life. So for the Crown to be saying, prove you've got these things after 200 years of the Crown attempting to eradicate them, it's hypocritical for the Crown, but it increases our challenge. If we don't have those things intact, what do we have which we measure who belongs?
So, Paul, I'm wondering, are you close enough in your negotiations or research to letting us know what is the end goal or how close we are to it, number one? And number two, is there something that the Peskotomuhkati people who are watching should be doing in either documenting or thinking or somehow assisting in asserting their rights?
Tough one. Because we have to do 3 or 4 things at the same time. And with the border closed, with the pandemic preventing travel, it's harder. We are at a point of a breakthrough after 15 years since Andy Scott, the Minister of Indian Affairs, promised recognition of a band. And federal officials say to us, why don't you go for a self-government agreement instead of Indian status? And the answer is because a self-government agreement would take 6 or 7 years to negotiate. And we've got older people who need healthcare right now, got younger people who need education help right now. You've got a community that needs administration funding right now. So the Indian Act is a vehicle, a known vehicle to get that right now. And we have a promise from 2 successive ministers to implement that. So what we need to do is create a founding members list, a band list. Now, one solution, and this hasn't been ratified by the community, and we have to figure out how to do that. We said this is one nation. New Brunswick's nightmare, for example, is 3,000 people coming across the border and demanding provincial health care. um, because tribal healthcare and U.S. healthcare is in trouble. Our solution is probably to say this is one nation. Every citizen of the nation has treaty rights. Every citizen of the nation has Aboriginal rights, including Aboriginal title to land. Everybody shares that. But when it comes time for services, we have 3 communities. Every individual citizen has to belong to one community only. And if the community is in the United States, you get the services that come from being a member of a federally recognized tribe. If you belong to Scoodic, the community in Canada, you get the services that come from being a status Indian. So we have 2 distinct concepts.
Well, and
Citizen of the
two
nation.
distinct questions arising out of what you just said. First of all, more a statement than a question, but a lot of people in New Brunswick would be happy to have a net migration into the province because there aren't enough workers paying taxes to pay the pensions of the retired people. It's an issue. Only 750,000 people in the jurisdiction the size of, a small city. So immigration is maybe not all that bad an idea. And second of all, the people in Canada already get health care. Why do you think that some sort of recognition or moving forward on Indigenous citizenship improves health care?
Okay, that's actually 2 questions, but they're bundled into bigger ones. If the Peskotomuhkati people in Canada want to survive and prosper as Peskotomuhkati, we need to recognize very clearly that the language lives on the American side and has been suppressed on the Canadian side. We want to have language speakers in the community and language teachers in the community. We need to bring people over across the border, across the river. That's one. Same thing goes for the culture. The ceremonies, the traditions, the stories, the songs, the dances, the things that make a people a distinct people have been suppressed on the Canadian side, protected on the American side to a far greater extent. So we would be looking for people coming home. And I've talked to a whole bunch of people who say, my grandfather, my great-grandmother was forced into Maine because the province was prosecuting people for fishing, because we got shoved off our land. There used to be 20 or 30 Peskotomuhkati houses on Indian Point in St. Andrews in the 1920s. Today, the Akaji family is all that's left. But the point is, bringing people home, bringing people back across the river is important for cultural survival. So immigration, absolutely. Should New Brunswick be pleased about that? My answer is, Canada takes in 300,000 immigrants a year from around the world, and it's having problems with people who've been here 10,000 years at least, bringing a few hundred people home. That's just unacceptable. But we hope New Brunswick and Canada accept the immigrants. Yes.
The other thing that came to my mind is if you do produce this so-called band list, or if I can call it a list of citizens, let's say, what if you miss a couple of people? What if somebody in Macadam says, well, wait a minute, I just found out my great-grandfather used to live at Indian Point and blah, blah, blah. How do you deal with that?
Okay, let me deal with your second question a moment ago, which is healthcare. And yes, the Indian Act, Canada's Federal Indian Act, does a couple of things on healthcare. One is enhanced healthcare compared to other people, which means, in practical terms, for example, you get a semi-private hospital room instead of being on the ward, or you get dental care that other Canadians don't. On the other hand, these days, it means you get 4 teeth cleaned a year, but it's real. And yes, you get education, you get your tuition and a grant toward books and living expenses in university. And that's important. And being a band as opposed to not being a band means somewhere between $250,000 and $500,000 a year in administration funding. So yes, there are real advantages to Indian status. There are also tax exemptions. What you just asked about,
The band
better
list.
the question.
The
The
band
band list. Okay, what we're arranging with Canada is actually because initially we were saying, look, let's make it incremental. Let's give people a chance to be added over time. Because Canada missed the boat. It was supposed to have done a band list in 1951 and it didn't. So it's going to take us time to fix this. And where we are now, I think, is an agreement with Canada that there will be 2 founding members lists. So list number 1 accompanies an order in council recognizing the band, not creating the band, and that's important, but recognizing its existence all along. And then a year or 2 years after that, we add the people who didn't make it onto the first list because they hadn't finished their genealogical research, or because they hadn't made up their minds to transfer from Sibayuk to Skudik, or because they didn't transfer from Tobik because they have one Peskotomuhkati parent and one Wolastoqey parent, and they didn't make up their mind to transfer over, or because they were out of province and didn't hear about what was going on and didn't show up in time. So the idea of having 2 lists covers exactly what you're concerned about, which is we never accepted the idea that there should be a closed list. The compromise is we're going to have a first list, and then we're going to take our time with the second one to get it right and make sure nobody's left out. And the other thing, and I have to mention it, is the final accord in the comprehensive negotiations we're working on will replace the Indian Act with something better. So if you don't make it onto the second list, it'll be only a few years before you make it into the definitive nation-based agreement with Canada.
Oh, huge topic, and I appreciate your walking me through it. I must have missed out on asking you something. Is there anything you'd like to add on this topic of who you are and where you come from and what that means before we wrap up?
2 things. Anybody who wants to see how it can go right off the rails needs to take a look at what happened with the Kalapu Mi'kmaq in Newfoundland, where an initial agreement was made that if you can track your ancestry back to an Indigenous person in Newfoundland, you can be a band member. And 1/3 of the population of Newfoundland applied for membership. And 160,000 people where they expected 5,000. And Canada and the Kalapu core people scrambled to try to figure out new rules. So that's a flashing amber light in the minds of federal civil servants we're dealing with. How do they know that the 5,000 to 10,000 people we're talking about won't become 150,000? That's one issue. And it's an issue for us too. The other side of it is once we decided that family, respecting family, is a core value, then the other challenge really is how do you exercise self-determination compassionately, respectfully, gently. At the same time, you're being asked to draw lines on family trees like that cartoon did. And we're dealing with human beings. We're dealing with families. We're dealing with, core identity. Who are you? Who do you think you are? There are people we're going to have to turn away, and we're going to have to do that in ways that aren't hurtful. And that won't always be possible. So this is a real test, not just of who are we, but even more answering that question: how do we behave? What kind of people are we? And in Haudenosaunee terms, you don't say, this is where I'm from. You say, this is the clay I am made of. And one of the things in Peskotomuhkati country is, how do you connect not just to the people, but to the land and the waters themselves? So that's the kind of conversation. It's not easy. It's harder in the circumstances, but we need to keep reminding ourselves that every time we make a decision about this, we put human faces on it. And people keep saying, it isn't just me, it's my grandchildren. So that's where it's headed.
Well, I wish you and all your colleagues wisdom and patience as you deliberate on all these things. And I wish New Brunswick, Maine, America, and Canada speed. Thank you.
Alan, thank you.